The first warning came from a world that had already won its war. The planet Karos Prime belonged to the mighty Varelian Empire, one of the largest military powers in known space. Its armies had crushed every resistance force on the planet within 6 days. The rebellion was dead. The cities were secured. The war was over. Then something started eating the victors. At first, commanders believed it was a minor containment accident. A few missing soldiers. Several damaged research facilities. Strange emergency signals from remote military bases. Nothing serious. Nothing that required attention from the Imperial High Council. That assumption would become the greatest mistake in the Empire's history. Far beneath the capital city of Karos Prime, hidden inside a classified military laboratory, scientists had spent 12 years creating a biological superweapon known only as Project Roth. The goal was simple. Create a living creature capable of turning enemy populations into uncontrollable weapons. The result was far worse. Project Roth was not a single creature. It was a rage virus. The virus infected living hosts and flooded their bodies with aggressive mutations. Bones hardened into natural armor. Muscles expanded beyond normal biological limits. Pain responses disappeared completely. Most infected subjects died within hours. The survivors became monsters. And every living thing they consumed helped them grow stronger. Military planners loved the concept. Release the virus. Let it spread through enemy forces. Watch entire civilizations destroy themselves. For years the project remained locked away because even its creators feared it. But during the rebellion on Karos Prime, an ambitious imperial governor saw an opportunity. The rebels had hidden themselves inside vast underground tunnel networks. Traditional weapons failed. Bombardments failed. Gas attacks failed. So Governor Selvek demanded permission to deploy Project Roth. Against the advice of several senior scientists, approval was granted. The virus was released into the tunnels. At first, the results seemed perfect. Rebel communications vanished. Entire resistance cells disappeared overnight. Scouting drones recorded terrifying images of infected rebels attacking one another with animal-like fury. Imperial commanders celebrated. Victory seemed inevitable. Then the infected stopped attacking each other. Instead, they began hunting everything else. Within 48 hours, the first military outpost went silent. Then another. Then another. Surveillance footage recovered from those facilities showed creatures unlike anything the scientists had predicted. The infected were changing. Evolving. Every consumed victim added new biomass to their bodies. Some reached 3 meters in height. Others developed additional limbs. A few appeared capable of limited intelligence. One recording showed a massive creature using a dead soldier's access card to enter a secured bunker. The scientists watching the footage fell silent. That was not supposed to happen. Project Roth was designed to create mindless predators. These things were learning. By the end of the first week, nearly 2 million infected organisms occupied the underground tunnel systems beneath the planet. And they were spreading upward. Cities began reporting disappearances. Entire neighborhoods vanished overnight. Emergency response teams entered infected zones and never returned. Military patrols found streets covered with blood but no bodies. The Empire finally realized it had created something it could not control. Yet even then, many leaders believed overwhelming force would solve the problem. After all, they commanded one of the greatest militaries in the galaxy. How dangerous could a biological weapon truly be? 3 days later, the first Imperial Army Corps was completely destroyed. Not a single soldier survived. And from orbit, observers watched in horror as a mountain-sized mass of living flesh began rising from the depths of Karos Prime. The infection was no longer spreading. It was growing. And somewhere beyond Imperial space, humanity was about to receive a distress signal that would change everything. The emergency transmission arrived at a human border station 72 hours after the destruction of the First Imperial Army Corps. At first, nobody believed it was real. The message came from the mighty Varelian Empire, a civilization famous for arrogance, military power, and absolute confidence. They rarely asked anyone for help, especially not humans. Yet the signal was genuine. Every authentication code checked out. Every security key matched. And the message itself contained only 6 words. Containment failure. Request immediate assistance. The operators at the station exchanged nervous looks. Empires did not send messages like that unless something had gone terribly wrong. Within hours, the transmission reached Earth Defense Command. Admirals, scientists, and biosecurity specialists gathered inside a secure briefing chamber. As additional data arrived from Kairos Prime, the room became increasingly silent. The footage was horrifying. Entire cities were gone. Industrial districts had become wastelands covered with organic growth. Massive nests spread across hundreds of kilometers. The infected creatures no longer resembled their original hosts. Some looked like giant armored beasts. Others moved on dozens of limbs. Several had merged together into enormous biological structures that continuously produced new infected organisms. One recording showed a creature absorbing the bodies of fallen soldiers directly into its flesh. Within minutes, the monster nearly doubled in size. Another video ended when an infected organism leaped hundreds of meters and destroyed the surveillance drone recording it. The final frame showed 6 glowing eyes staring directly into the camera. Then the feed ended. A human scientist paused the footage. No natural ecosystem can support growth at this rate. Another nodded. It's not an ecosystem anymore. What is it then? The scientist looked around the room. A biomass conversion event. The term immediately caught everyone's attention. That was one of humanity's worst biological nightmare scenarios. An organism that converted all available life into additional copies of itself. Not a predator. Not an invasive species. A planetary extinction mechanism. The room remained quiet. Finally, Admiral Sarah Kane spoke. How much time do they have? A projection appeared above the conference table. The answer was not encouraging. If current growth rates continue, a researcher explained, the infection reaches total planetary dominance within 23 days. Someone cursed under their breath. Another officer leaned forward. What happens after that? The researcher changed the display. Dozens of star systems appeared. Trade routes, jump gates, civilian traffic corridors. The infection's possible expansion routes. If even one infected organism escapes Kairos Prime aboard a ship, nearby colonies could be compromised within months. The room suddenly understood the scale of the disaster. This was no longer an imperial problem. It was becoming a galactic threat. The Varelian Empire continued sending reports. None were encouraging. Their orbital bombardments had failed. Ground offensives had failed. Chemical weapons had failed. The infection simply consumed everything sent against it. In some cases, the attacks appeared to help it grow. Entire military divisions vanished. Several cities were abandoned. Millions of civilians were evacuated into orbit. Millions more remained trapped on the surface. Then came the report that changed everything. A massive biological structure had emerged from beneath the capital continent. The object measured nearly 30 kilometers across. Scientists initially believed it was a nest. Further scans revealed something far worse. It was building spores. Planetary-scale spores. If launched into the upper atmosphere, they could spread infection across orbiting stations and evacuation fleets. The room fell silent. Everyone knew what that meant. Containment was beginning to fail. Admiral Kane stared at the latest images. The Empire had created the ultimate bioweapon. Now that weapon was preparing to leave its birthplace. Finally, she turned toward the assembled officers. Prepare the sterilization task force. Several Varelian representatives immediately objected. There are still survivors on the surface. Kane nodded. We know. You cannot destroy the planet. We're not planning to. The Varelians looked relieved. Then Kane continued. We're planning to save it. Nobody in the room yet understood what humanity's biosecurity doctrine actually meant. But soon, the entire galaxy would learn why humans treated uncontrolled biological threats differently than everyone else. The briefing room on Earth Defense Command went dark as new plans were projected into the air. Admiral Sarah Kane stood at the center of the strategy chamber while holograms of Karos Prime rotated above the table. The infected planet looked less like a world now and more like a living organism made of violence and hunger. Every update from the Varelian Empire made the situation worse. Orbital stations were evacuating civilians at maximum capacity. Military fleets were forming defensive rings around the system. But the infected biomass below was still growing, still adapting, still preparing something none of them fully understood. A young analyst finally asked the question everyone was avoiding. Why don't we just bombard the surface until nothing moves? A silence followed. Then Admiral Kane answered calmly. Because it won't stop it. She tapped the hologram. The image zoomed into infected clusters spreading through underground oceans of biomass. This isn't a normal biological outbreak. It's a conversion system. You don't kill it by destroying bodies. You only feed it more material. Another officer leaned forward. Then what's the alternative? Kane didn't hesitate. The human containment doctrine. That phrase immediately changed the mood in the room. It was not often spoken outside classified circles. A senior scientist pulled up the doctrine file. The screen displayed a single warning line at the top. When biological systems achieve uncontrolled exponential conversion, conventional warfare becomes invalid. Below it were 3 steps. Step 1, isolation. Step 2, atmospheric denial. Step 3, sterilization event. The analyst frowned. Atmospheric denial. Kane nodded. We remove the environment it needs to survive. She expanded the plan. Human ships had already begun deploying around the Karos Prime system. Massive orbital platforms were taking position above the planet's upper atmosphere. Each one carried arrays designed not for destruction in the usual sense, but for atmospheric restructuring. One officer looked confused. You're talking about planetary burning. Kane did not deny it. We are talking about controlled atmospheric ignition. A heavy silence filled the room. The idea was simple in theory, horrifying in execution. The infected organism relied on breathable atmosphere, moisture cycles, and organic transmission pathways. If the upper layers of the atmosphere were converted into a sustained high-energy burn layer, nothing biological could survive transmission or growth. But there was a problem. A large problem. There are still millions of civilians on the surface, a Varelian liaison said sharply. You cannot just burn the planet. Kane turned toward him. We are not burning the planet. She paused. We are burning everything above it. The distinction did not comfort anyone. A technician activated another display. It showed evacuation corridors, orbital shuttles, and overcrowded Varelian transport fleets struggling to pull survivors from infected zones. But the timeline was collapsing. The infected biomass had begun forming something new in the capital region. Long-range scans showed synchronized movement across thousands of kilometers. It was as if the entire infection was preparing for a coordinated release. A planetary launch event. If it succeeded, spores would reach orbit within hours. And after that, every ship in the system would become a carrier. The analyst whispered, it's learning how to escape. Kane nodded once. That's why we don't wait. She turned to the command staff. All orbital units are to begin final positioning. Once we activate atmospheric ignition, there will be no second chance. A junior officer hesitated. And the Varelians? Kane's answer was quiet. They lost control of it. A pause. Now we decide whether it leaves this system. Outside the command station windows, fleets of human ships continued moving into formation around Karos Prime. Silent, precise, unwavering. Far below them, the infected world pulsed like a living wound. And for the first time since the outbreak began, something on that planet finally reacted to humanity's arrival. It started to look upward. From orbit, Karos Prime was no longer a planet in any normal sense. It was movement. It was growth. It was a breathing mass of converted life stretching across continents like a spreading disease made visible. Human fleets held their positions in a perfect ring around the world. The Varelian Empire ships stayed farther back, damaged, shaken, and desperate to contain the shame of what they had created. Then the sensors changed. Every orbital station registered the same anomaly at the same time. A coordinated spike in neural activity. Not random. Not chaotic. Organized. A human sensor tech whispered, "That's not possible." The infected biomass below had begun synchronizing. Across thousands of kilometers, separate infection zones started moving in patterns. The largest mass near the capital continent rose higher, forming towering structures of living tissue. Smaller clusters aligned themselves around it like organs supporting a central brain. A planetary nervous system was forming. Admiral Kane stared at the display. "It's coordinating," she said quietly. A Varelian scientist shook his head. That level of collective intelligence should not exist. The virus was never designed for cognition. Another screen flickered. A transmission burst appeared from the surface. Not human. Not Varelian. Something in between. A broken pattern of signals that slowly resolved into structure. Then a voice emerged. It was not spoken. It was reconstructed from millions of infected nervous systems working together. The words were fragmented, overlapping, led. Growth. Survival. More. The bridge went silent. The infection was not just consuming life anymore. It was thinking. Then came the second transmission. This one was clearer, stronger, focused, and terrifyingly directed upward, toward the human fleet. A single concept repeated through the signal. Join. A technician stepped back from his console. "It's trying to communicate." Another corrected him immediately. "It's not communication. It's assimilation behavior." On the surface, the central mass began changing shape again. This time, it wasn't random growth. It was construction. Gigantic layered structures rose into the sky, forming something like a biological antenna. Millions of infected bodies fused together, creating a column of pulsating tissue that reached higher and higher into the atmosphere. Orbital sensors detected a surge of energy inside it. Admiral Kane's expression hardened. "They're trying to breach orbit." The Varelian commander beside her looked stunned. "That's impossible. Nothing biological can survive that ascent." Kane didn't take her eyes off the display. "It's not trying to survive." A new projection appeared. Inside the rising structure, smaller infected organisms were detaching and forming hardened shells around themselves. Like spores wrapped in armor. Designed for one purpose. Impact delivery. "They're building launch vectors," the analyst said in disbelief. The planetary system below was no longer just an infected world. It was becoming a weapon platform. And then something happened that no one expected. The central mass reacted directly to the human fleet's positioning. Every orbital ship received the same transmission. Stronger this time. Clearer. Almost deliberate. "Leave. Or become." The message ended there. Admiral Kane slowly turned toward her staff. "It knows we're here to stop it." A long pause followed. Then she made the final call. "Begin atmospheric ignition sequence." Below them, the infected world continued its transformation, unaware, or unconcerned, that humanity had just committed to ending its existence. Or perhaps, it already knew, because deep inside the rising biological tower, something new had just formed. A structure that mirrored human signal arrays. Learning, copying, preparing, and for the first time since the outbreak began, the infection did not just react. It anticipated. The activation order went through without hesitation. Across orbit, human platforms powered up in sequence. Silent machines locking into alignment above Caro's prime like executioners forming a perfect circle around a dying world. Admiral Sarah Kane watched the final countdown on the main display. Below them, the planet was no longer subtle in its intent. The infection had fully revealed itself now. Vast biological towers reaching into the atmosphere, pulsing with coordinated movement. The central mass had become a command core of flesh and nerve, surrounded by millions of lesser organisms preparing for launch. It was building something that looked uncomfortably like an escape system. And it was almost ready. A Varelian officer stood nearby, voice tight with desperation. There are still evacuation ships inside the lower orbit lanes. If you trigger atmospheric ignition now, they will clear the blast radius, Kane interrupted. That is not a guarantee. Kane finally looked at him. It's the only window we have left. A tense silence followed. Then the confirmation came from engineering. Atmospheric ignition arrays at full charge. Field dispersal ready. Every human ship in the formation locked its systems onto Karos Prime's upper atmosphere. Not weapons. Not bombs. Something far more precise. Orbital atmospheric restructuring emitters, designed to strip stable oxygen cycles, collapse chemical pathways, and convert the upper atmosphere into a sustained energy barrier. A controlled planetary burn layer. Not to destroy the planet. To erase its ability to host life. The analyst whispered, "We're going live." Admiral Kane gave the final command. "Begin." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the sky above Karos Prime changed color. A thin line of light appeared across the upper atmosphere, circling the planet like a glowing scar. Within seconds, more lines followed. Orbiting platforms fired synchronized energy pulses into the atmosphere, igniting chain reactions in the upper chemical layers. The planet's sky turned from pale gray to deep incandescent orange. Then white. The infected towers below reacted instantly. They surged upward, accelerating growth, pushing spores toward the rising heat barrier. Millions of biological launch units detached from the surface, attempting to breach the atmosphere before the ignition fully stabilized. It was a race. And the infection was fast. Too fast. One Varelian commander shouted, "They're going to make orbit." Kane didn't respond. Her eyes stayed fixed on the central structure. The core mass had stopped expanding outward. Instead, it was focusing all growth upward, compressing itself, refining shape, narrowing into a single vertical spine of living matter. The infection wasn't just trying to escape anymore. It was adapting to the burn layer, learning how to survive it. A technician's voice cracked over comms. It's changing composition. It's hardening outer layers. It's using the heat as structural reinforcement. The analyst looked up in disbelief. It's evolving in real time. Then the worst update came. A cluster of infected launch spores breached the lower atmosphere. They hit orbital altitude and detonated. Not explosively. Biologically. They opened like seeds, releasing clouds of microscopic infection directly into space lanes. A warning alarm echoed through the fleet. Containment breach detected in Orbit Corridor 7. Another followed. Spore dispersion confirmed in upper orbit. Admiral Kane's jaw tightened. So it had learned that too. The infection didn't need ships. It only needed one successful ascent. And now it had achieved partial orbit exposure. The Varelian commander looked shaken. "We failed." Kane shook her head once. "No." She pointed at the display. The atmospheric ignition layer had fully stabilized now. A continuous, burning shell wrapped around the planet's upper atmosphere like a second sun. And below it, the infection was still trying to grow upward. Still trying to reach space. Still burning itself alive in the process. But then something unexpected happened. The central structure stopped reacting to heat entirely. Instead, it began absorbing it. The analyst stared. It's converting thermal energy into biomass stability. Kane narrowed her eyes. Can it keep doing that? A long pause. Then the answer came. Not indefinitely. The sky above Karos Prime became a war of physics and biology. Human engineering against alien adaptation. And in the middle of it all, the planet itself turned into a furnace of living conflict. But deep inside the central mass, something new emerged again. A final signal. Not aimed at ships. Not aimed at orbit. Aimed at humanity itself. And this time, it carried only one meaning. We learn. The message echoed across every human vessel in orbit. We learn. No distortion this time. No fragmentation. No chaos. Just clarity. Admiral Sarah Kane stood motionless as the words repeated through the fleet's communication systems. Behind her, Alarms continued reporting spore activity in high orbit, but none of it mattered in that moment. The infection had achieved something no one thought possible. It had stabilized itself under planetary sterilization conditions. Not fully, not safely, but enough. The central mass on Kairos Prime was now a towering spine of hardened biological matter stretching toward the burning atmospheric shell. Its surface constantly cracked, burned, reformed, and hardened again in an endless cycle of destruction and adaptation. Humanity had tried to erase it. Instead, they had trained it. A Varelian scientist spoke quietly, almost in disbelief. We didn't contain it, we educated it. Kane didn't respond immediately. Her eyes remained locked on the planet below. The atmospheric ignition layer was still active, a continuous white-hot ring encasing the world. Entire regions of the infection were collapsing under the heat. Millions of organisms were being reduced to ash every second. But not fast enough. Not completely. And now it was learning how to survive the burn. A technician reported from the lower fleet. Spore density in orbit is increasing. They're forming structured clusters. Another voice followed. They're not drifting anymore. They're organizing. The infection had begun building patterns in space. Microclusters of biological material were forming into repeating structures, stabilizing themselves against vacuum exposure using heat-absorbing cellular layers adapted from the planetary surface below. It was no longer just a planetary threat. It was becoming a system-wide phenomenon. The Varelian commander finally broke. We unleashed it, he said, voice hollow. We thought it would destroy our enemies, not become one. No one corrected him, because there was nothing left to correct. Admiral Kane finally spoke. Prepare final escalation. A pause. Even the humans in the room looked at her in silence. One officer asked carefully, "You mean orbital sterilization impact?" Kane shook her head. No. She expanded the hologram. A series of deep space arrays appeared, massive structures far beyond Kairos Prime's orbit. Gravitational atmospheric stripping. The Varelians went silent. A scientist whispered, that would tear the upper atmosphere apart completely. Yes, Kane said, and collapse any remaining biological cohesion. The infection reacted instantly. Another transmission surged upward. Not words this time. A structure. A map. A representation of the infection's entire planetary network, flashing in real time. It was analyzing humanity's plan, learning it, and then adapting to it. The central mass began compressing inward, drawing energy from the burning atmosphere, from orbiting spores, from every remaining infected cluster across the planet. It was preparing something final, something unified, a last response. Admiral Kane's voice dropped. It's going to attempt a full system breakout. The infection's goal was no longer survival on Kairos Prime. It was escape from Kairos Prime. At any cost. The first gravitational arrays activated. Space itself around the planet began to distort slightly, subtle at first, then increasingly unstable as controlled fields started pulling at the upper atmosphere. The burning sky began to tear. Below it, the infection responded with its own final evolution. The central structure split open, and instead of one organism trying to escape, it released thousands, millions, coordinated biological launch units, all hardened by heat, all synchronized, all carrying the same objective. Reach orbit. Spread beyond it. The fleet opened fire immediately, not with weapons of destruction, but with containment fields, interception bursts, and thermal disruption pulses. Space around Kairos Prime turned into chaos. Spore clusters detonated. Biological launch units shattered mid-ascent. Entire infected formations burned out under atmospheric collapse. But still, some got through. A handful. Enough. Admiral Kane watched the first successful cluster stabilize in orbit. Small, fragile, alive, and learning. It turned toward the human fleet. Not blindly, not instinctively, intentionally. Then it copied something new. A human communication protocol. And broadcasted it back. A simple repetition. Not a threat. Not a plea. Just understanding forming in real time. We learn. Kane closed her eyes for a brief moment. When she opened them again, her voice was steady. Complete system sterilization. This time, there were no objections. Only silence. Because everyone in orbit understood the same terrifying truth now. They were no longer fighting a weapon. They were fighting something that could learn faster than extinction could finish the job. And as the final escalation sequence began, Caro's prime burned brighter than a starless sun, while something inside it learned how to survive the end of worlds. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more HFY adventures among the stars.